mean the.
Just for me.
Okay.
I don't deal with things. I can take something. But it's been painful through the therapy.
Are you through?
I can quit, but I don't, on Friday, but only on balance
Yeah.
and strength.
Yeah.
Something there,
I'm
like,
100% down, you know, and
Okay.
135%.
I get tickled at, Mary's in rehab with her and Nita. And it's just little community. There's like almost 10 of them that are in rehab.
Ladies, doing good?
There's 5 of them.
I was thinking about you.
Four.
Some
One
next week,
got some.
but I put a sound clip of the last castrata in my, like we're talking about the unit opening,
And there's 2
something like that,
football players.
recording the last castrata. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's 9 teams that are there all at the same time. I mean, I think it's got their own little, and then there's
Yeah, I like that. Remember, like,
dynamics.
seeing
The
like.
guy that runs one of the voting graduated from
Found it
JC.
for written bill. Which is parents make you
Did not want
in the nursery.
Oh, okay.
famous.
Oh, that's where they're all going.
Okay.
So he's kind of over it. But it's
Good.
just,
but
So this is question.
my understanding is that parents, essentially like,
a lot of stuff.
They were.
Stay
rock
on.
stars.
yeah, I know.
I remember in a class. Going through that. Kind of the same thing. The boys did.
Yeah.
Had a 6th grade house. Boys, you know, like, what you're saying. Why? It's uncertain.
My dad.
Years ago.
When your mom died.
Boys, I think, they,
Heck, yes, sir.
I
And
said,
all of
does
a sudden,
anybody
you
know?
realize it's not,
Yes.
and it's the, mentally, there's just that.
I was getting worried, I was getting off. I know, let me get that other license where you were supposed to have something come up.
Well, we used to.
One of the boys back.
That's right.
The lights, yeah. Monday through the library, so we have library.
Oh, really?
Good morning.
Had Laura.
What's your statement? Center, where?
Yeah, I had this one done about 11 years ago.
Okay.
So kind of knew what to expect, but it went bad. It's gone better. And maybe we talked.
Yeah.
I knew what it was. Hey,
How you feeling?
Week prior to
they're
that.
good.
Little swollen.
Laura every day.
But
Tom,
You still in active PT with someone, or you haven't done
Friday,
that?
they told me not to rest. We're gonna strengthen that. Not still gonna stand.
I haven't seen them stand on one foot for years. I mean, see how wiggly I am?
I can't do that.
Well, I can't do it on my right. Right now. Sir? Maybe I'm leaning against the wall. Maybe that's it.
I can't think about it, look at it, go fast. One told text from Facebook.
Can't find the remote. Can it turn on otherwise, or is there? Yeah, I just need to get it on. We got one, I don't think. It doesn't.
Here's the remote's nested on, there's a piece of it back here.
Now, remember, Steve's always been there, thank you.
I think the,
And yes, I remember I had trouble last time, and this time I, did all last night, rebooted it.
She does it.
well, if you have to do the same thing on the TV, more than trying to get on YouTube.
I think last time it was more my computer, I may be wrong, I think. Okay, good. Okay, good, thank you.
So we're gonna start working on movies.
Huh?
Working on the screen groups.
Well,
These three exercises.
I've been working, I've been, you know, cause I hadn't played almost 6 months. So I went to play. I've been watching YouTube videos. I had all this great concept in my head. Going back, I lost it when I played back when I to change or
Decidedly older crowd, my age.
see, I'm,
Decidedly
and I
older
don't,
crowd,
I
you're a
don't
young guy.
the news one. I just have my head. But,
I was watching that, I was thinking.
I'm not showing a film.
yeah, in other words, your lower
I can find the
body.
remote, I turned out it's behind. I was trying to ask you, you're busy. I looked at the cabinets and I screwed around and talking about trying to find another way to do it all. Now I know. Johnny and John.
Don't let it go. But you know. Why do I expect?
Well, good morning, everybody. We, go ahead and get started. To have everybody here. And today's class is Acts 8, verses 1 through 25. Here with our ongoing story. And we'll start a few review slides. These are some slides I've been using just to remind us of our foundation for our study of Acts. You have up here the Old Testament's new chapter, because we're looking a lot at the Old Testament origins of Acts and how the apostles are really deliberately, with guidance of the Spirit, carrying out God's mission to claim the nations. So I want to mention a name. Paul, a few weeks ago, talked about his work. Michael Heiser, who devoted his life to studying these particular issues. We're going to go over some slides that outline some passages that are important to him important to us as well. I don't have a slide about the 3 rebellions in Genesis, but it's important to remember those. One we're most familiar with, Garden of Eden, but also in Genesis 6, some imagers of God, divine imagers, sinned human beings and created a race of giants. And then chapter 11, another story we know very well, the Tower of Babel. So we'll go to that. We're going to look at a verse from chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, the Song of Moses, where Moses, as a prophet, tells what has happened in the past as he's speaking to the people of Israel before he bids them farewell. Look at a quick summary of Psalm 82, and then we'll see some verses that are foundations where we are right now. Look back, so we'll jump into our story. We'll also review a little bit from last week's class that Scott told us about. Stephen, this is a verse we keep coming back to. I'll let you read it. I stand here. But Moses tells the people that he gives different nations their inheritance. These are nations that are listed in Genesis chapter 10. He fixed their borders according to the number of the sons of God. These sons of God are the divine beings who will now supervise those nations. Yahweh's done with them because of man's sinfulness. Garden of Eden, what happened in Genesis 6, flood, still sinfulness, rebelliousness, culminating in the Tower of Babel. His portion is a new nation he's going to create, Jacob. Then Psalm 82 is an important verse. We find out that these 70 nations that are mentioned in Genesis 10 are in darkness. Ooh, went a little fast here. The shepherds who are supposed to be these divine beings have not shepherded them, and these people are in darkness. God pronounces judgment on these divine beings. They're going to be judged like men. He, meanwhile, God is going to judge the earth, inherit these nations. And so what we have seen is at the end of Luke, beginning of Acts, both written by Luke, there's a connection where Jesus reveals to the disciples God's plan to inherit these nations. We saw this particularly in Luke 24:47. Jesus said to them, repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. I'm going to mention it now. We'll mention it again in a few more slides. This is where we've been, in Jerusalem. Scott generally had a slide saying the Jerusalem Chronicle. That's really where we are in our story. You are witnesses of these things. And behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you to stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. That's been a big theme in our classes, power from on high, this power of the Spirit, and these individuals being full of the Spirit. I want to highlight this statement, repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations. These 70 nations are mentioned in Genesis 10, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, are going to be reclaimed. God's human imagers, his disciples, followers of the way, are going to do this important work. It's an ongoing work. And Acts, second part of verse 8, be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth. There's a particular reason for focusing on Jerusalem. This is the city of David, Zion, and in Judea, Samaria, basically all of the kingdom of Israel that has been their kingdom. The land given to them is going to be reclaimed. Today, we're going to get to Samaria first time. We had some foreshadowing of that last week. We're going to get into that story very directly today. So, Day of Pentecost is when it all begins. All the peoples who were there, different nations. Now a little bit more review of our class, Jerusalem Chronicle. So far, this commission has only been occurring in Jerusalem. This is where the witnessing has been done. And last week, we looked at Stephen's speech in Sanhedrin, and his martyrdom. Poignant story, an inspiring, brave speech, also a speech that raised some questions we explored last. And some questions I had never even thought about that we did the study. One of the things about teaching is you learn a lot. Huge turning point in our story is Stephen's martyrdom. Not only is our first recorded death for someone following the way, witnessing and then dying for his faith, but it leads to a change in the trajectory of this mission. We want to look at a few key points. First, some intriguing questions that Scott raised last week. It's worth looking at them again. Stephen is one of the 7 servants. Sometimes our versions call them deacons, but they're not. They're servants. There is that word, but these are men who are designated for a particular purpose to serve the Hellenistic widows or Hellenistic Jewish widows who are not being taken care of. 2 of those men, one of them Stephen, the other Philip. Philip's going to play a big role in our story today and next week as well. But we find out he's a Hellenistic Jew. He's quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament translated in Alexandria, and it's the version that Jesus quotes from and Paul quotes from. He makes some factual points that diverge from the Masoretic text. This is something I didn't know about. I just read Stephen, and I didn't make connections to the factual errors. But he also makes some points that clearly draw from the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is all new information for me too, folks. So this also diverges from the Masoretic text. This raises a question that we can't definitively answer. Is he, in fact, a Samaritan? That blew my mind. I'm skeptical, but it's a possibility. Something's going on here. This is one question. I easily try to come up with 3 possibilities. There may be more. Did he live in Samaria for a while? Was he exposed to the culture and their version of the scriptures, and then he drew on it? It was important to him for some reason. Or is he just a broad-minded Hellenistic Jew, and he's drawing from a lot of different sources? Either way, it would have been troubling misstatements he made before the Sanhedrin. Not only that, what he tells them, and we want to look at his key points. But I just want to leave you with this. As we dig deeper, we find out things that we can't maybe definitively know. It shows us the richness of God's story and the diversity, complexity of God's people. Our God is beyond our understanding. But we're pretty complicated too. Got married couples here. Probably are still trying to understand each other. So we rarely do things for just one motive. Very complicated. So Stephen, I think we see in this story, he's a complicated guy. Now some key points I summarized from last week. Moses, whom the Jewish leaders almost said worship. I decided to put revere there, but they really exalt Moses. I mean, we see this in when Jesus is having controversies in Jerusalem. They revere him above all others. We follow Moses, but he prophesied about a greater prophet than he. That greater prophet, Jesus of Nazareth, was murdered by these very individuals. In murdering Jesus, the Sanhedrin followed their own history of rejecting God's representatives. And so, I left this out, but Stephen talks about Joseph, talks about Moses, talks about David, and then the prophets very briefly, finally the Messiah himself. If we want to stop short of saying they worship Jesus, I think they definitely worship the temple. The temple has become a stumbling block, an idol to them in a way. So they're exalting the temple. Stephen reminds them it's a structure made with human hands. And then another point he makes, this is something I didn't think about from reading Stephen's speech over the years, but looking at different commentaries, Stephen's making points about where God connects with individuals. For example, where he comes in the burning bush to Moses and says, this is holy ground. So one of the points is wherever God is holy ground. And he's not confined by the temple. He never really asked for it to begin with. It was David's idea. Then eventually Solomon executed it. God, allowed it, blessed it. And this raises the question, which we don't have time maybe to explore, but we're spirit-filled. God is with us. This is holy ground right here, and wherever we are is holy ground. And it's something maybe to think about. It struck me. I haven't thought seriously about that. This idea wherever we go is holy ground. But I think that's where Stephen is going. Now, finally we're at verse 1 of chapter 8. And this is a continuation at the end of chapter 7. Stephen is stoned, horrible pain, but he replicates Jesus' statement, asking God not to hold this against him. We're killing him. I love how it ends. He falls asleep. To me, I think about John, multiple verses where Jesus talked about we have eternal life now. Don't suffer a second death, fall asleep. I don't know if that's what it's saying, but it just connects to me in that way. But what do you, when you see this verse, this is an image or many images of this event, but this one just shows Paul standing, observing, approving. People have taken off their cloaks, rolled up their sleeves, and, Paul's kind of keeping track of stuff. Any reactions? We know what this guy is going to become, but if we didn't know, if we're just reading up to this point, he's clearly a villain in our story. We know stories, adventure stories, Star Wars stories. He's got villains, Krennic and others. This guy. Yeah. Any reactions? We move. Yeah, this is carry over from chapter 7. We're going to carry over even more.
Generally, villains have an ulterior motive, and they know what they're doing is wrong. And don't believe that he thought what he was doing was wrong at all. He was doing God's will.
Yes.
And it would make him villain. That idea.
Is the person a villain if they're doing what they think is the right thing, if their motives maybe are proper? I don't know if that's the right word. I didn't expect Hitler to be brought up. One thing to keep in mind about Hitler, he's a human being, loved his mama, dogs, I love my mama, and what else? Yeah, but horrible person. Sad that people were revering him. What we're seeing, it's like they forgot the evil perpetuated. It was people, and I think Satan's influence. I like what Johnny said, because the Pharisees, one thing I think it's important to remember, I think they had good intentions at the beginning. The Sabbath is just being flaunted. We see that in Nehemiah. Anytime Nehemiah leaves Jerusalem, everything falls apart. At the end, he's pulling on men's beards because people are violating the Sabbath. They're not obeying God. So there were some guardrails that were put in, and those guardrails became more important than the actual scriptures, particularly inspired word. When we think about the Torah, one of the things when we were studying Stephen, and I was doing some background reading, trying to keep up with where we are, is that there was an oral tradition, there's a written tradition. Oral tradition had equal weight. We know that's always the issue among God's people. Take our tradition, they have equal weight, God's inspired word. But it started, I think, for good motives. Now we're at the point where a man is being killed, and it's really, I think Scott explored last week, it's more of a lynching. It's extrajudicial. It's in the moment of really highly charged emotional moment. These people cannot bear to hear what Stephen is saying. They're covering their ears. I think that's fascinating. They don't want to hear the truth. Reminds me of the movie, You Can't Handle the Truth. Do we have a volunteer to read this particular section? Just trying to make the font big enough so we can see it. But it's not too clear.
Now on that day, a great persecution began in the church, all except apostles scattered throughout Samaria. Devout men speak, make loud, small, trying to destroy the church. In one house after another, dragged off both men and women. Now those who had been forced to scatter went around proclaiming the good news of Philip went down to the main city of Samaria and began to proclaim Christ to them.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. We're going to, that last sentence, last bit there, we're going to repeat that just a bit. Just raise a general question here. Any details about, I think, worthy of just unpacking a bit? Good question. I don't have a definitive, to use that word again, answer. I wondered the same thing, and I don't think I've ever really thought about it. When you're trying to teach, you dig a little deeper, like, why are they there? Why weren't they attacked? Because one of the things it seems, this happens as Christianity spreads, the Romans, and we'll deal with the Romans later. We continue this over a couple more semesters. We'll get through the rest of Acts. Romans don't tend to be very systematic in their persecutions. It's off and on. Depends on the emperor. A lot of times they just leave Christians alone. Roman government has bigger things to deal with. But one of the things that the Romans did do is they tended to go after leadership. possible answer is that they've already had targeted, whipped them, and then you had Gamaliel's warning. Maybe they're leaving them alone. That's one possible. But I wonder, how the apostles escaped this? Others are being arrested. Maybe they're just trying to get different. Maybe if Saul's doing this, we would think, and we'll see this later, 2 weeks, we'll look at chapter 9 and what happens to Saul, great transition in his life. But he has actually some letters of authority. It seems like he's not doing this on volition. For some reason, it's possible. It's a great question. One we should ask. I think these questions lead, even if we don't get the definite answer, I think it's important to be questioning people. Other things.
You have Paul without Steve.
Absolutely. You wonder, when Paul says, I am the worst of sinners, I think he's thinking back to that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian, mentioned Hitler, so we had to go there. One of the last victims of Hitler's tyranny. Very brave man. Writings are really worth looking at. But his book, Life Together, he talked about Christian fellowship. He made a very popular point. And I'm only saying that because you're coming. So you guys are leading me. If I go off on rabbit trails, it's your fault. Anyway, but Bonhoeffer wrote something that struck me. We all should be saying first sinners. That's the heart of Christian fellowship. I tend to think my brother has a bigger plank. I have a little speck. It's harder for us to serve, love each other and serve out. It's a very provocative point. Made me think of the original Spartacus movie where everybody's saying, I am Spartacus. And we go before God and say, I'm the worst of sinners. This guy says, no, I'm the worst of sinners. Everybody's like, no, I'm the worst. But Paul, I think, genuinely felt, not sure. But anyway, good points. Without Stephen, I think it's a hugely important turning point. I think it's paving the way. Surprising. Yet. Other things.
Hear about the sequence and thoroughness of the words. It says every, except, does that mean every believer other than the apostles? And if so, who buried Stephen? And did Paul break their house, entering their house? Was it sequence out of order, or just maybe Paul went places did? So, kind of the answers to those questions later.
There's a lot of different, I guess, interpretations here going on. And I know how we might write it today is different from how Luke and these other individuals have written things. We hear everyone, like, does that just mean 100% of people? And I question that. I don't, Luke's obviously writing with intentionality. The Spirit's guiding, but, he's not a robot. He's not AI. He's writing as a human being, being guided by the Spirit. So I think it's one thing that phrase to me is showing this is a pretty widespread persecution. Also, the devout men, some people have suggested that these might have been devout Jews who were bothered by it, weren't following the way. They felt that Stephen was unfairly targeted. And it was an extrajudicial killing, wrong all the way. We don't know. Or it could have just been devout followers of the way. I think we definitely get the picture of Paul trying to clamp out his time. Stephen's death, direct charge to the leaders of the Jews, Sanhedrin. This has to be stopped. And also we give men and women being targeted. It's about men, about men. Yes. Would have been a mixture of Judean and Hellenistic. The Hellenistic Jews would have been obnoxious. We've explored this in the last few weeks. They're very Grecian, their culture. They're more what we would call synagogue Jews as opposed to being temple Jews. They generally have lived parts of the Roman Empire, may not have been able to make it when it does. So temple doesn't have the huge significance to a Grecian Jew that it would for a Judean. So there's all kinds of divisions. One of the fascinating things to me learning, we didn't have time to talk about this, but just looking at synagogues, there's bunches of them in Jerusalem. Found out that one of them, the synagogue of Freedmen, was the one that was having trouble with Stephen's preaching. That was the specific synagogue that brought charges against him. Basically, you got these synagogues that have different rabbis who are teaching different things. I'm thinking about Christian denominations, and even within churches of Christ, are different divisions. The synagogues think like that as well. Anyway, yes.
Also talk about and their motivation seems just jealousy. Like how, where they find
Question.
it seems like take certain religions, radicalize, and become but take Christianity, radicalize Christianity, but where do these guys?
I think there's fear, but you're right. What they're doing is that, and I'm sure, again, makes me think back to Johnny's comment. I'm not trying to resolve. I think they're thinking there's fear here. This means justifies. I mean, the end is protecting what they see as truth. Yeah, I don't think they have authorization. I wonder if they ever fail. I've heard that even preach is an interesting point that this actually gets the mission Jesus authorized. It's finally jump-started. Took persecutions to get people into Samaria. So, and there's foreshadowing in Stephen's speech that he's drawing on some, Samaritan sources. So, that's a fascinating thing. Again, Luke, these writings are masterfully done. The individuals who are writing, there's intentionality. Now, this accomplishes God, in a providential way, accomplishes God's mission.
You mentioned similar to lynching. And that goes to a group of people. Group mentality loses their morality. Because when there were lynchings, there were for sure people that were part of that group, individually that were part of the thing. Then when that group mentality started.
One of the fascinating, God has gifted us all. I think we all have common, diversity among humans and also moral diversity, but we have a need. I think there's a common need to love and to be loved. Depending on how you're treated early on, that can be very distorted, but also we want to belong to something ourselves. And going on Johnny's comment, we're part of a bigger movement. We have that feeling we will feel empowered and do things we would never have done by ourselves, good or bad. You see the crowd psychology and movements, ball games, whatever. Good points. Yes.
Got to see here there's time to stand quiet.
Or move to another area where you can be effective. But definitely. And that's what Philip does. And we'd like to know more about this. Philip and Stephen would have been close associates. We would think brothers, friends. Obviously, Stephen's death would have affected him. Did he and Stephen talk about this? This is where we're going to be going. Whatever. This is where Philip seems to intentionally go. And that's what we're going to get to next. Appreciate very much the comments. This is a map I found. And just look at it with me. And anything that strikes your attention, you don't see Jerusalem. It doesn't appear on this close-up map. You see Samaria. You see Nazareth. But I think our key areas here, Mount Gerizim. Is that right? Shechem. But I think this is the center of things. I don't think all of this area is inhabited by Samaritans. It's called Samaria. Anyway, thing that strikes you guys from the map. We move on to Philip's story. One thing that strikes me, I haven't seen maps displayed this way, but basically to get from Galilee to Judea, you have to go through Samaria, unless you cross the river. You have to go out of your way to avoid the Samaritans. And we see sometimes Jesus did, sometimes Jesus didn't, sometimes he did. Yes, what?
Was it a common thing?
I wonder. I don't know. That's a good question. Because we know sometimes Jesus deliberately went to Samaria, which means that's an intentional thing, which makes you wonder if that's not the norm. Talk a little bit about the Samaritans. Did last week. Scott showed us a fascinating film. Gave us a lot of detail about a few modern Samaritans, where they live, how they worship, their beliefs. And this area today is kind of that contested territory. So I was reading, I don't want to get too far in this rabbit trail. I was just reading how a source from like 2002, things have changed greatly since then. The Samaritans at one level were under Palestinian authority, loyal to that, but they also were drafted to the Jewish army and were very proud to do that. So they were kind of living between two worlds. Bit of continuity for the Samaritans from, the time of Jesus, the apostles now. Be thinking about this. This is, I think, the area where Philip's going to be centering his work. We're going to be talking about it. And this is a passage, Scott mentioned this last week. And I don't know if that was an AI image, but it was pretty funny. There were people running and lions running along with them. But this is from 2 Kings. I like to use the Legacy Standard version. But I have up there at the top, and we saw this last week in the film that Scott showed us, the people that are modern Samaritans, they trace their lineage to the northern kingdom directly. And they kind of skip over this part. Probably there's some people who were left behind by the Assyrians, people who were brought in by the Assyrians. There was intermarriage. So the modern Samaritans would be the lineage of that. But we have here, without reading it, you can read it on your own. The Syrians had the policy of deporting and then importing new people from the different ethnic groups that they had conquered. So you got these people from different areas under the Assyrian Empire were brought into Samaria, replacing the people of Israel who had been moved out. And they live there. They don't fear Yahweh. Lions are sent. They're being attacked. The Assyrian king's response is to take a priest from the people of Israel, go back, teach these people the customs of God of the land. Scott and I have talked about this privately. People in the northern kingdom have been apostates throughout. I mean, the time Jeroboam took over. They were all evil kings. Jehu at least did follow, Yahweh's instructions to a degree. And you had some powerful kings, but we never hear of any of them turning the people back to God. So whatever that priest would have known, it would have been a bit distorted. It wouldn't have been, it would have been a very, I would think, perfect representation of Torah. So I think from the beginning, they weren't being instructed well. Plus, they had their own beliefs to be as well. So what's going to happen with these individuals? There's going to be a blend, God's instruction, their own native beliefs. It's going to be kind of, as I have on another slide, a hybrid of teachings. And just real quickly, I don't know if you can read that. It's a smaller font. The Samaritan woman, fascinating story. Jesus, going there and engaging this woman. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim. You people say that the place where people worship is in Jerusalem. So the Samaritans had a different holy mountain where they worshipped. They believed they were right. These are the ruins of that temple. We saw that in the film last week. Actually destroyed by the Maccabean leader, John Hyrcanus. This is in the 2nd century BC. And the Maccabeans restored for a time Jewish leadership after being governed by the Greeks. After Alexander the Great, then the Romans and Pompey the Great came in and ended that independence. This is the ruins of their temple. I was going to say this, thought it was better to just put it on the slide. But some key points that strike me about the Samaritans, we saw it in the map. Samaritans are right there. Sometimes you may have an enemy who's farther away, but the enemy that's nearer to you is the one you're going to be angrier at, have more enmity with. And you really can't escape the Samaritans. you're traveling back and forth. You can't go over go east of the Jordan River, but they're there. You're going to run into them. You know they're there. They're practicing this hybrid form of the law. I think that makes them more obnoxious than a Gentile who doesn't even know about it, because they've taken the law, they've brought in these other traditions, and that just makes them, in a way, more dangerous, more obnoxious. So I think they're geographically closer. They're more threatening to devout Jews. I think it's hard for us to even imagine the enmity. We have our own issues with ethnic divisions today, but this is a serious division, and this is dangerous territory, if you will, where Philip is going. Dangerous in a, I guess, spiritual sense. What I want to do here, we got Acts, we're going to replay verse 5. Philip went down to the main city of Samaria, began proclaiming the Christ to them. And then, at this point, one of the areas where the Samaritans had their own way of doing things, they followed only the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They have their own Samaritan Pentateuch, which Stephen was quoting from. So they don't accept the prophets. So one thing I thought was interesting that I read in a commentary on these verses was, if Philip's going to preach to these people, how's he going to reach them? Because they come from a very different framework than he does. So think about the road to Emmaus. He's not going to be able to talk about the law of the prophets. They don't accept the prophets. So more than likely, he goes straight to the man that they agree with, the Sanhedrin. They all revere Moses. And so we have from Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses' prophecy. And this is from verses 17 through 19, a bit of both. And Yahweh said to me, I will raise up a prophet from among your brothers like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it will be that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So this is probably the way that Philip reached them, is through Moses. And our next few verses talks a little more detail about the work he did. Verses 6 through 8. We have a volunteer reader.
Crowds were paying attention to one mind. Philip said, heard and saw miraculous signs. Unclean spirits crying loud shrieks coming out of paralyzed. There was great.
Okay, we see Philip is doing the same work. Apostles had done earlier, and this, I think, recalls us back to Jesus, healing people. There's always the emphasis on individuals who are paralyzed or lame, but he's probably healing other diseases, and then casting out the unclean spirits, crying with loud shrieks coming out. So these signs confirming Philip's message. I want us to get a little further. I would stop for some discussion. We've had some great discussion. I want to get to this man here. First, we have a modern image of him. Simon the Great. We have another reader. This continues from this description of Philip's work, the signs, and the versions that are occurring.
Now in that city, a man named Simon, who had been practicing magic. Simon is great. This man, power, made both things had made a long time.
Now we think of this, we hear of this man as Simon the Sorcerer, Simon Magus. I want to, use the phrase Simon the Great. That's how he's being acclaimed. Now he's saying I'm someone great. People are giving him an even greater title. Anyway, anything strikes you about Simon? He's being introduced. Continue. He only appears in the sequence of Acts chapter 8, although there's plenty of traditions about Simon. Church tradition. He's recounting the only. Right. We see images of him. He's dressed in black for a reason. I think black's a great color, but That's the color that's given to him to show this. He's getting power from the unseen realm. It's not the power of the Holy Spirit. It's lesser power, but it's impressive power. We don't know all that he's doing, but he's doing enough that people are very amazed. Now, I mentioned Michael Heiser, his work, and we're going to draw, in fact, we have a slide or commentary from Michael Heiser, and we can draw different conclusions about Simon. I'm going to show you where I land as far as this story. This is one of those stories that people have disagreed about over the years as far as what's going on here. And I thought this was very fascinating. This again points out the Samaritans have their own traditions. They're following the first 5 books of the Bible. They have their own, if you will, Aramaic dialect, their own translation. So based on their translation, this is coming from Michael Heiser's work, they have different, what they're attributing to Simon is the power of God. There's some implications. The wording in the translations can also reflect a belief that he is the angel of the Lord. And one thing we've explored very, very briefly, and this also comes from Heiser's work and the work of a lot of other scholars as well, but the Jews at this point, the Jewish rabbis, the teachings is that there's 2 Yahwehs. There's a visible Yahweh and there's an invisible. Visible Yahweh, we would all know, is Jesus. Once the Jesus movement gets out, they clamp down on this belief because, you know, followers of Jesus are saying he's the visible Yahweh. They're like, no, he's not. And so they stop, teaching this particular thing. The visible Yahweh is very often the angel of the Lord or God appearing to Abraham as he did directly. The angel of the Lord would have been seen as the visible Yahweh or Jesus leading the people out of Egypt, doing other great things. So I want you to have in your minds the idea that Simon is being called visible God, which would be, we know the visible God is Jesus, who Philip is preaching. So just keep that in mind. I think it's pretty provocative. It got me thinking about the story a little differently. This man is being acclaimed as, the incarnate God. Well, continue our story. What happens to Simon? We have another.
They believed Philip was proclaiming good news about the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ, and to be baptized, both men and women. Even Simon himself, after he was baptized, stayed close. And when he saw Simon's miracles were occurring,
Okay. Any reactions to these 2 persons?
whatever he could do.
Absolutely. He says he's amazed at power.
King was coming.
That's something to think about, because this is the guy who's been acclaimed as the great, but now he's been baptized. He's following Philip, staying close to Philip. Any ideas about why he may be staying close to Philip? Hanging out with Philip on a daily basis. Possible.
I guess I've always viewed his motivation to be and also power by which I thought were magic or
Yeah.
just the life actual power.
Appreciate John's comment, because that's one way for us to look at it, because we know what Simon's going to do.